give a warm welcome to the hosts of the Bride of Alternate Ending.
Hello, ghouls and goblins, and welcome back to Bride of Alternate Ending. I am your ghost, Brennan Klein, here as always with my co-ghost, Tim Brayton. Hello.
I think the only thing that could have made that better, you were doing a, spooky haunted house voice, and I think if you had done a Crypt Keeper voice, that would have absolutely been my favorite thing that had ever happened in the history of this this podcast.
Okay, I don't know if I can do a Crypt Keeper voice.
You know, the Crypt Keeper voice is one of those things that sounds like it should be easy, but when you try doing it, I've never heard someone do a good one.
Yeah.
It's weird.
We gotta leave it to John Kassir.
You gotta leave it to John Kassir. But yes, we are here to, I can't even come up with a pun. But yes, we're here to talk about a horror movie, about a pseudo-ghost movie, or maybe a real ghost movie, hard to say, one that is deeply, deeply important to my heart, and I gather potentially not quite as deeply important to yours.
Well,
but that is sort of where we'll get at, I assume, by the time the episode is done. But in the meantime, what are we talking about this month, Brennan?
Well, this month, because it's spooky season, we are diving in deep into one of the classics of haunted house literature, one of the most adapted haunted house stories, I would say. I don't think it's possible for there to be a more adapted.
I absolutely cannot even slightly think of anything. I'd be hard-pressed to come up with anything that's been adapted 3 times, and this one's been adapted, 14.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because The Haunting has, I guess, 3 if you count the Liam Neeson one.
Which even though that's really an adaptation of the House on Haunted Hill, really more so than The Haunting of Hill House, we gotta count it.
Yeah. So I guess that's second place. But yes, we are going to be diving into adaptations of the 1898 Henry James novella, The Turn of the Screw, which I really quick want to know, have you read The Turn of the Screw? Do you have a history with this novella?
So I have, and I might as well sort of reveal quickly because it's going to sort of overlap. I have read the novel one time. I have seen The Innocents, which is the film we're going to be talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
I have seen The Innocents many times. So there is a degree to which The Innocents has overwritten the novella as, the definitive version of the story in my brain. Mm-hmm. But I have read the novella, yes.
Okay, so...
Have you read the novella?
Yes, I have. I came to it the way that Henry James intended, which is I saw the movie 2020's The Turning, and then I was like, there's a nugget of something here that they are failing to grasp, so I read the novella afterward.
Well, I mean, it makes sense that once you've seen the most faithful adaptation of a work, you would want to then compare that adaptation to the work itself.
Yeah, exactly. And I gotta say, not a fan of the novella either.
I am unsurprised.
By that me, or just...
For you.
Yeah.
I think the novella is real swell. Henry James is not a specific favorite of mine, but I think he's good, and I think the novella is good.
Okay. I think that there is one extremely spine-chilling passage in the novella that I think about a lot, but the rest of it I could kind of take or leave.
That is fair. I'm curious, have you read other Henry James?
No, I can't say that I have. I don't think so.
Well, he's good.
Yeah,
I don't know that he's your speed, honestly. I don't know that I would push you towards any Henry James, but I'm a big old 19th century fiction nerd, so for me he's cozy and good.
Yeah, no, that's something that's not outside of my wheelhouse. I just haven't taken the plunge really.
Sure.
But yes, so The Innocents, this is my first time approaching this 1961 film, directed by Jack Clayton of that Great Gatsby adaptation with Mia Farrow.
That is both extremely accurate, and it feels at least a little bit unfair to Mr. Jack Clayton.
Probably. That's the...
He hasn't made that many movies.
No.
He sort of very legendarily / notoriously took his goddamn time making up his minds on projects. He made a film in 1959 called Room at the Top that was just a major deal in Great Britain. It was kind of like the originating form and also like the pinnacle of kitchen sink realism. Just an absolutely phenomenal Lawrence Harvey performance, and that's not a phrase you get to trot out every day. But movie was a great big deal. Movie opened every door that Jack Clayton could ever want to have opened, and it sort of gave him this like very, I mean, we can't say neurotic because I don't know the man, but like basically a very neurotic sense of like he had to always pick exactly the right project.
Oh.
So he like became very prone to dithering before making movies. He only made 3 movies in the first 15 years of his career, for example.
Yeah, so there's not a lot to compare to as far as like his biggest titles, because there just aren't that many titles in general.
Yeah. I will say, though, he did do one other horror film besides this, which was the Disney film Something Wicked This Way Comes, adapted from Ray Bradbury.
Oh.
So that is a point of comparison that I certainly think favors The Innocents myself, but that's another story.
Yeah. And also, I get he really went for adaptations when he could, it seems like.
That was his thing.
Yeah, okay.
That was absolutely his thing.
Good to know. Yeah, I don't have a lot of background on him. I just bring up The Great Gatsby because I think about that Mia Farrow line all the time, where she's like, "Oh look, there's a bird on the lawn."
And I respect that. It's more that I like Jack Clayton, and I wanted to associate him with good movies, and not his Great Gatsby adaptation that I think is frankly shit.
I mean, that'll happen when you're poking at The Great Gatsby.
It would appear to be the case.
Yeah. But anyway, we are
the
here
graveyard of good film directors.
Yeah, Jesus. Yeah, so we are here to talk about The Innocents. For those who are not familiar with the seminal text, The Turning, the plot is as follows. A governess named, she's going to become a governess.
James gives her no name, but you were saying something else than I was. Yes, a governess in training.
Yeah, sorry, I'm describing the plot of The Innocents as opposed to the plot of The Turn of the Screw.
Well, I thought you were describing the plot of The Turning.
See, I really was just going for a joke that then muddied the waters, so that's on me.
Okay.
Well, basically, I was saying if you are not well read on the fundamental text of what this is adapted from, which is The Turning, then this is what The Innocents is about.
All right, I will shut up and let you give a plot synopsis.
Yes, a young woman named Miss Giddens, played by Deborah Karr. Kerr, right? Carr. British people.
Maybe you can drive my car.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
I would drive that car.
Oh, I bet she.
If you know what I mean.
She is luminous. Anyway, so she's a young woman named Miss Giddens. She gets her very first post as a governess. A man known as the Uncle in the credits, played by Michael Redgrave, who is the first of 4 members of his family to appear in adaptations of The Turn of the Screw.
I mean, to be fair, it's sort of a Harry Potter situation. Every British actor has at some point been in an adaptation of The Turning, because there's so many of them. And there are so many Redgraves.
Yeah, it's just statistically improbable that they haven't. It's kind of like if you're an Australian actor, you've been on Neighbours. That's just how it goes. But yes, so he hires her to take care of his niece and nephew, Flora and Miles, whose parents have died, I believe, in an unspecified way, right?
I believe it's an unspecified way, but I also feel like it is not meant to be cryptic and mysterious.
No.
They're just dead.
Yeah, they are dead. It's Britain in the late 1800s. That can happen.
It was probably the Boer Wars.
Exactly. But yeah, so we've got... Well, when she shows up, she's got Flora, played by Pamela Franklin, who is a seemingly, like, cheerful and nice girl, and Mrs. Gross, the housekeeper, played by Megs Jenkins, which is a great name.
It is such a good name.
But then, quite quickly, it turns out that Miles has been expelled from his exclusive boys' boarding school. He's played by Martin Stevens. He gets sent back as well. And basically, Miss Giddens begins to see what she believes to be apparitions or ghosts of 2 former employees of the household, Miss Jessel and Peter Quint. They were carrying on, as we say.
They were.
Indeed. And she begins to believe that the children are being possessed by the ghosts of these wicked deviants.
Yes. Which, to be fair, if a ghost is trying to inhabit the spirit of, like, a 12 and 10-year-old child so that they can continue having an affair using those child's bodies, that is pretty authentically deviant, I would say.
Yeah, I would say so too. Or is this all in the overcooked imagination of Miss Giddens?
Indeed, is it?
Yes, but which is, see, and I think we discussed this recently. This is a plot point that generally fails to gel with me in horror literature and cinema.
We have discussed this a number of times, and I respect that. And my solitary defense in this particular case, I think James invented it. Certainly, if it exists before 1898, I don't know where.
Yes, no, I think that's completely fair, and like I said, there's at least one incredible moment in that, and it's definitely worth checking out if you're interested in that kind of horror sphere. But yeah, so credit where credit is due. I just boo to him, right?
Hey. Yes.
You know, there are lots of things that people are the inventors of that turn out to be bad things.
But I'm saying it wasn't a stupid cliche when it shows up in The Turn of the Screw.
Yes, you're right. and that's not to say that this is a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. It's just not a thing that I enjoy that much.
I get that. And I would also say, and I think this might be a calibration question.
Okay.
If your goal is to come into... And I'm going to routinely sort of blur the waters between The Innocents and The Turn of the Screw.
Sure.
Because I do think this is a fairly faithful adaptation. It's actually technically an adaptation of a stage play adapted from the book, but I feel like it is very close. Like you're not going to walk out of this and have a horribly broken idea of what's going on in the book.
Correct.
And it is incidentally an adaptation written by no less than Truman Capote.
Oh yeah, that was surprising to me. I had not heard that before jumping into this.
I'm not a Capote scholar, so I'm not going to go around saying like it doesn't feel like an important Capote text. It is not, to me, a script that bears his voice.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Like,
and
I
it
think
is impeccably British as well.
It is extremely British, which is I think part of the reason that I don't see Capote in it or hear Capote in it. I imagine he was there because it has to be extremely delicate and sensitive in how it talks around sex. Mm-hmm. And that feels like a skill set that Truman Capote exercised.
I would say
in
so.
a very good way. Yes, I have no idea where I was starting to talk. Yes, I do. So I think there's a calibration question here. If you come into The Innocents because you want to get a rip-snortin' good horror movie, I think that you have a very different experience of the plot than if you come into The Innocents because you want a psychologically acute adaptation of an 1890s novella by a psychological realist.
Yes. That is extremely fair. Yeah, I would say it also depends on the flavor of horror movie that speaks
also
to
that.
you.
But I'm thinking strictly in terms of are the ghosts real or not question. It works for me here quite literally more than it works in any other film. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason for that is if you are watching this film because you want to get inside the strange and potentially very fragile brain of Miss Giddens, that's what the conflict is, really. Like, are these ghosts real, or is she just that, like, fucked up about her own sexual desires because it's Victorian era and that's how they do? To me, that's where it becomes like, well, it has to be, are the ghosts real or are they not? Because the question is basically, is this a haunted house, or is the only thing that's haunted Miss Giddens' own morbid fascination with sex? Mm-hmm. Basically. Okay,
so I have a question.
Yes.
Just before we like really dive into how well this movie evokes that. So obviously, Turn of the Screw is generally regarded as a text about, repressed sexuality in the ways that it kind of poisons the mind.
Yes.
And there are very obvious signifiers to that, but I feel like, to me, both texts allied sexuality so much and in such a specific period context that I would like to fully break down what we're looking at.
Okay.
Because obviously there's the fact that, as I said, Quint and Jessel were carrying on, and the idea of two people doing that in such an open fashion is so flatly horrifying to Miss Giddens that she assumes like the most wicked evils that they are capable of.
Yes.
But when you say her own sexual desires, do you mean just like her relationship to sex, or do you think that there's a sexual component to like the way she's living her life right now?
I think it is certainly the movie. I don't know if I don't recall if the book is quite this clear with it. The movie hinges on her finding Miles sexually attractive, I think. Not Miles embodied by Quint, but the actual 13-year-old boy Miles.
Okay. See, because this is an element of both the innocence and the turning. I don't remember the original text either, but yeah, where Miles is certainly coming onto her, or at least has more of a grasp on his own sexuality.
He's definitely doing the thing that like an adolescent boy is like, I'm going to hit on all the ladies because I'm sophisticated. And Miss Giddens, unlike most older, humans who are like, okay, you're just being an idiot child, go away now, does not have the life experiences that allow her to do that. So she kind of gets a little bit too weirdly fixated on the fact of his burgeoning sexuality, I think. I would not want to say this is the story about repressed pedophilia. Mm-hmm. I think that is unfair. But I do think there is a degree to which she is rattled and thrown by the sexual advances of a child in a way that a fully matured adult human should not be.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. See, because... Okay, great. Yeah, no, I just wanted to break that down because there's a lot of stuff in here that is very carefully danced around, as we talked about. And I wanted to make sure we were on the same page. But no, that makes sense. I always thought of it as just a general kind of like her reacting to sex in the world and less about her grappling her own desires. But I can see that kind of being one and the same.
I mean, because to me they are kind of one and the same, because sort of the whole point of Victorian sexuality is that's really the reason that we get this sort of ongoing, I think, puritanical obsession with, like, the question of whether women have sexual desire and are sexual agents and whatnot. That, really, I think you have to get through the 70s until Western culture's finally willing to say, like, well, obviously women enjoy sex. I think that's a hangover from the Victorian era where, like, men could enjoy sex because they were just brutes. Mm-hmm. Just terrible, terrible brutes. But women, like, and I think in a real sense, women were perceived as not enjoying sex. Mm-hmm. Like, it was just not a thing that their bodies were built for. And I think they are one and the same because, we know that that's not true. Mm-hmm. And so there's this sort of cultural expectation that if you ever feel sexual desire, that is sort of a manifestation of evil in your female body. And I think that is kind of, to me, they are one and the same, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also, I think it also makes sense that, okay, let's establish that I am correct in this. Because Henry James and Truman Capote are both gay men, right?
Truman Capote is, yes. I actually
for sure.
I don't have the slightest idea about Henry James. Let me see if I can track that down.
Let's double check. And obviously, sexuality in that time period is a more amorphous thing that generally literary historians more speculate on than can really put a bead on.
We know about Oscar Wilde, we know about Walt Whitman, and I think everybody else we're just guessing.
Yeah. But I'm fairly certain that Henry James is among that number of at least like speculative non-straight people. But if that's the case, I think that makes sense why they would both be more primed to pen a story about this kind of repression of sexuality. So
as I'm reading the Wikipedia page, and of course the Wikipedia page is different than scholarship, there has certainly been a ton of speculation. He certainly had close male friends who were out homosexuals. And people were speculating very early on that something was up because he was so, like, outwardly celibate. So I am going to say that the Wikipedia article, at least, has me convinced that Henry James was both probably gay and probably did not ever actually do anything about that.
Okay, and
except maybe a handful of dalliances in his youth.
Okay, and that makes a lot of sense where this is coming from.
Yes.
Like, that is the type of man who would be able to understand what a woman's desires were going to be in that time, because they exist outside of that spectrum of the, like, you are the brute and you are claiming your sexual whatever, and so I think that makes a lot of sense why that would come from this, even while that binary was still being really strictly enforced. Okay, great. So while we're on that subject, yes, so that makes a lot of sense, and then that is where the kind of are the ghosts happening or not is birthed from. For me, I think, look, I wasn't expecting the Innocents to, be a scare-a-minute haunted house thrill ride, because
sure,
I've read The Turn of the Screw, and again, this is an extraordinarily faithful adaptation.
I just want to argue that I think there is 1 minute with one scare, and therefore I think scare-a-minute is a perfectly adequate description.
Okay, great. Well, which minute are we talking about?
I was doing a bit. I don't actually have it in mind.
Oh, okay. No, yeah, because I don't know if this is not, again, this is not really the goal of The Innocents, but I don't think I would say I was scared at any point watching this movie.
I mean, there's a couple moments where we see the apparitions of Quint and Miss Jessel, and Quint is played in this capacity by Peter Wingard, who I think is a very crucial ingredient in this film's broth, even though he doesn't really have to do a lot other than just kind of look, again, very brutish, just very...
just stare through windows.
That is a man who has seen naked ladies and has done things with them. You can just tell from his eyes. But I think a couple of those work well as jump scares. I would otherwise say that insofar as this movie wants to be a horror film, and I have thoughts on that question as well, but insofar as this movie wants to be a horror film, it is strictly operating in the mode of atmosphere.
Yes.
Just like it is going to just kind of be a constantly ethereal, spooky place to be, and very rarely to never actually jumping out and saying boo.
Yeah. Which,
like, oh, sorry.
Which wasn't the mode of this kind of movie in this time period, and this is 2 years before The Haunting, also.
Right, and that's what I was going to say. Like, it's very difficult for me to, like, disentangle this film from The Haunting. And The Haunting, I think, is trying to jump out and say boo to a degree that I don't think it created that impulse, but I think certainly it's closer to what we would view in, the modern world as being like a horror movie. And I know enough people who view The Haunting as a sort of like exemplar of like an old style classical horror movie, that when I say, well, that's much more in line with what we now think of as horror, I'm already kind of acknowledging how much The Innocents is not what we currently think of as horror. It is strictly an exercise in atmosphere, I would say.
Yes, but I don't think that discounts it from being horror, especially in the way that this atmosphere works so fundamentally to smother you with its muchness.
Yes.
And I think that that's a different vein of horror, but it's not like a, gimcrackery kind of like William Castle kind of horror movie.
Right. This is not. I'm trying to think of like what films Hammer would have been releasing the same year this came out, and they would have involved like virginal barmaids and tight tops like being chewed on by vampires. This is not that.
Yeah, exactly. But I will say the one moment that really, really freaked me out in the book, I don't think is achieved as well visually, and I don't know that it could be, but it's the scene where Miss Giddens sees Miles out on the lawn staring up at her window, and then realizes that he's actually staring a floor above her. And I think that's incredibly well realized in the book, and maybe one of the flatter moments of the movie.
Yeah, honestly, I had forgotten that beat from the book because I think, again, the movie has sort of overwritten the book in a lot of ways in my brain. It would be enormously complicated to stage that in a movie because
Yeah.
of the way that eye lines work.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it would be hard to stage it in a way that wouldn't involve Deborah Carr being like, he's looking a floor above me, which would of course just murder the scare.
Yeah, exactly. So I do get it, but let's talk about the atmosphere, because that's what The Innocents.
That's
is.
what The Innocents is. So we've talked about Jack Clayton, who, you know, is a director of kind of these psychological prestige adaptations. But there's another fellow we just have got to talk about if we're going to talk about atmosphere in The Innocents, and that would be Freddie Francis, the cinematographer, who was actually, this was his last film in that capacity for many years. He returned to cinematography almost 20 years later. He shot The Elephant Man for David Lynch, and then he worked a few times with David Lynch before his career ended. So he moves over to directing for Hammer directly after The Innocents, and he also directed some films from Amicus. So he began work. He was working in horror for quite a while, but this is his magnum opus as a cinematographer.
I should imagine it would be anyone's.
It is arguably the best looking black and white cinematography of the post World War II era. Would be a take I would be willing to sign off on, I think.
I think that's fair. You've certainly seen more than me, but it is hard to compete with the just pure aesthetic that this movie is offering.
It is a film that basically the studio won one battle and lost one battle. Clayton and Francis wanted it to be in black and white, and I don't think they wanted it to be in full frame and Academy aperture, but they didn't want it to be widescreen. The studio won widescrreen, it is a CinemaScope production, possibly to its advantage, possibly not, but excuse me, the filmmakers did get to shoot it in black and white, which that certainly is an important victory. This is a film with, I can only describe them as velvety blacks. You're sinking your fingers into this just plush blackness of some of these frames.
Yeah, they're luscious, and the shadows are palpable.
Yes.
Yeah, it's, and then and obviously the way that the lighting interacts with those blacks and makes the figures in front of them stand out it's this perfectly smooth, beautiful thing to behold in any frame.
It's wild because it is both very high contrast in that it is basically just these thick inky blacks and then sort of pale China doll faces. But at the same time, it's not actually high contrast cinematography. There is a full grayscale. It's just that it's kind of being elided except for the edges in a weird way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is a fucking gorgeous movie.
Yeah, and outside of the specifics of the lighting and color, there are so many things going on in this movie that are just really, really sumptuous and beautiful to behold. One thing that I'm especially partial to in this movie is the way that the camera and the costume interact to create atmosphere. So
interesting.
Yeah, especially Miss Giddens is wearing those enormous hoop skirt dresses that are really stiff and heavy and unmoving that make her look like she's just gliding across the ground when she walks. And the camera is almost always gliding with her and kind of centering her, and it's just got this feeling of this effortless, fluid motion because you can't see her feet, and it just looks like she's just floating around this movie.
Right, I completely agree with that. I think there is a sort of very glassy feeling to a lot of the way that move. Just in general, it feels, it is a floating kind of movie, and that is very key to the atmosphere, I think. In that it's a movie that just feels sort of amorphous and foggy and not entirely present as we're trying to watch it. My own vote for the not cinematography aspect of the film that I think does the most to kind of amp up its atmosphere for me would be the music.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the music and the sound design in general are also really impeccable.
the sound design is exquisite, but there is, so the movie opens over black with I guess pseudo folk song has to be the only way we describe it. It was written for the film by George Auric and Paul Dane. George Auric, who then wrote the entire score. But it feels like one of those weird bits of like British rural ephemera that just sort of gets like extracted from the world. Like it feels it has a very strong Wicker Man vibe to me, and I know Wicker Man is of course 12 years later than this, but I get that same sense of like it felt like you found some isle in the Hebrides and like one 8-year-old child was singing this song and no one else had ever heard it, and you're like, that's it, that's what I want for my movie. But it was written for this. But then that song is brought in as a motif, and it just has this sort of macabre, childish... Again, like, in my mind, I went to an 8-year-old is singing this weird song on a goat herding island or whatever. So it's both innocent, if you will, but in a way that's kind of like heavy and the song just feels wrong. Like it's not like a avowedly like violent or scary song, but it has this kind of droning melancholy feel that just feels kind of slightly unpleasant.
Yeah, and also specifically British.
And also specifically British. And bringing that back in as the motif for the film, I think just works so well.
Yeah, and I might be wrong about this, but it might be the motif that plays when she discovers the music box as well in the attic.
I believe that is correct. I would need to look back at that.
Yeah, me too.
That moment specifically.
I think it is. I remember feeling that in the moment. But yeah, so I mean, okay, so the bottom line is that the movie didn't 100% work for me as a story because it's a faithful adaptation of a story I don't like that much. But basically, from an aesthetic standpoint, I don't see a way to not enjoy the experience of this movie, from the editing to the sound to the cinematography. Like, everything's really working really well, but so are the performances. Yeah.
I would say of the performances, because that is to me one of the crucial things about this film. I've already mentioned Peter Wyngarde, but this is my favorite Deborah Carr performance. And in that I have been joined, I'm in very good company. That was also the opinion held by Deborah Carr.
Okay, great. So she would know.
This is her favorite of her own films, or her favorite of her own performances. I think there's a really wild piece of casting involved. So Deborah Carr is by 1961 fully established. She is a superstar. She has been in tons of movies. She's been Oscar nominated. She's been BAFTA nominated. I believe she was... I don't actually know how old she was. She was not...
She was like 38.
Nearly. She's like 38. That sounds right. She is not remotely as young as the character, like, presumably was written. I mean, I guess I've never really gotten down into the nitty-gritty of the novella to be like, is it ever clarified exactly how old she is? But it is difficult to imagine someone who has just emerged into the world for her first governess job being... governess, there we go. Being 38, right? And they are not making Carr look young. It's not like we're going to dress her in dresses and give her hairdos and makeup to make it seem like she's in her 20s. Like, they're letting her look her age in a way that I think has tremendous value for the film. Like, it's not like a movie about a middle-aged woman, but they're letting it be about someone who does not feel like a kind of virginal ingenue, which sort of, I think, sharpens for me the degree to which it is about this, like, conflict between innocence and knowingness, innocence and maturity, virginal versus sexual. And I think it just on top of that, she's doing phenomenal work with the role. Like, it is a role that requires a small number of notes from the actor playing it. She basically just has to be kind of a basket case who's seeing things and like getting very fluttery about that. But those notes need to be played right, and I feel like it is a type of character I don't believe I've ever seen done better than what Carr is doing with it in this film.
Oh, absolutely. And also to speak on her age, I think that it certainly doesn't undermine the film, especially because in this cultural context, like, I think it helps that, a virgin doesn't have to be a young person, It's the years and years of this buttoned up virginal lifestyle weighing on her like a series of stones that are pressing her into the ground.
Exactly. It makes it feel just sort of more desperately repressed. Like a 20-year-old who hasn't had sex, it's just like, okay, just you'll get there.
Yeah.
A 38-year-old who hasn't, like, you can sort of feel an edge there.
Yeah, that is a bit of a age-blind casting that really works, as opposed to, let's say, Greer Garson in the 1940s Pride and Prejudice, where she's 36 and she's always like, "I'm 1 and 20, darling," and it's not like that.
Have not to go down the rabbit hole. Have you seen the 1936 Romeo and Juliet starring Leslie Howard and Norma Shearer?
No, I haven't.
Every last goddamned member of that ensemble is 15 to 30 years too old for the part they're playing, which is never good for anybody, but for Leslie Howard in particular, he's one of those, like, prematurely weathered Brits who, like, came out of the womb looking like a 40-year-old.
Uh-huh.
So to have him, like, preening about as this, like, impetuous, hothead 18-year-old boy is just mortifying.
Oh my goodness. It's kind of like Luke Perry in 90210 also, where he's, like, still hot, but he's like, I've got these forehead wrinkles and a receding hairline, and I'm a bad boy in high school.
Love it.
Anyway, easily distracted. Us? Never.
Never.
So, yes, Deborah Carr is great, but I particularly was drawn to Martin Stevens as Miles. I think that's a really good child performance.
I think it's a really good child performance of a really tough role.
Yes.
Like, it is a role that the entire film hinges on in a big way, and I think it's extremely easy to imagine it going horribly wrong, because, like, there aren't that many good child actors. There were way fewer in 1960 than there are now. I'd say that's one of the handful of ways that film has unambiguously gotten better. We have better child actors. But, yeah, it's like, it has to be this kind of weird mix of, we absolutely read him as a pubescent boy who's like, I'm going to hit on my governess and read that as, like, idiot youthful brashness. We also have to be able to believe that he is carrying the soul of a, like, 30-something, like, Lothario.
Yes. Yeah, like, there's some really, really good moments. There's that moment where he's reciting a very macabre poem that's very eerie, but especially in the showdown at the end where she and him are alone in the house and he enters, like, I believe the greenhouse is where she's, like, preparing to confront him. And that performance when he walks in, it's like, well, holy shit, this guy's a fucking adult. I don't know what to tell you.
It's, again, this is a director who was able to get a rock-solid performance out of Lawrence Harvey. So Jack Clayton had some sort of mystery sauce that he was able to apply to his actors and do phenomenal things with that.
Yeah, so I don't think I could point to anything in Innocence and say that it's bad. I can just point to things and say that that's not to my taste, and that's totally a different thing.
Right. And I respect that. And going back to one of the things I kind of put a pin in, how is this horror? And I agree that it is. It's psychological horror. There are probably ghosts. Maybe there are not ghosts. I don't know. I always walk away from the film thinking there are not ghosts. There is just heavy, crushing, spooky, scary black levels. But I do feel both the book and this film fall into the genre of horror that thinks it's too good to be horror. And I it does not surprise me, nor even necessarily did it disappoint me when I saw your star rating on Letterboxd, that is something you would find not your thing.
Yeah. And it's not that I'm this, like, bloodthirsty gorehound, like, show me tits and slit throats or else I won't enjoy this movie. But
I mean, to go back to The Haunting is horror and it's proud of it. It's like, we're gonna rattle and bump and boo. And again, I think The Innocence is like, horror. I'm a psychological thriller, man.
Yeah, it's definitely about approach and tone, and especially, like, The Innocence is a lush and sumptuous and beautiful movie, but it's not it's reveling in being beautiful, whereas let's specifically hone in on the production design. That's reveling in, like, look at this palatial estate and how gorgeous it is. And then The Haunting is like, we're going to shove as much spooky shit into every corner of this house as possible. And it I guess, is more of an enthusiasm for being what it is. You're right.
Exactly. And I mean, to be clear, as a story of Victorian sexual repression with these just, like, rich, evocative, luscious sets and costumes and lighting and everything, I am crazy in love with The Innocents. But as I'm gonna go watch a horror movie, I'm gonna get spooked, I'm gonna, like, paw at my date and be like, there's a ghost. It's nothing. It is not that. It is not trying to be that. And I think it is, again, I think it's slightly disdainful of the idea that might be something people want it to be, in a way that I'm not defending the movie by saying that. I'm saying, like, you know, it is a ghost story, and it does clearly think it's too good to be a ghost story.
Yeah, which is it. It is a very, very solid adaptation of The Turn of the Screw in that way as well, because that's just what it is. And, you know, I wish that The Turn of the Screw was different, because that's a weird fundamental. That's not what The Turn of the Screw is or wants to be. And I don't think that there is a better version of that. It
is certainly hard for me to imagine a version of Turn of the Screw doing something right that The Innocents didn't do. I don't know where you improve on it. Like, what do you, like, stick a pin in The Innocents and be like, well, that's where we're going to improve our version. Like, it is a flawless version of itself.
Yeah. Which, anyway, so it's just complicated. You know, it all comes down to a matter of taste. I certainly didn't expect, like, a genuine, like, horror movie. It's certainly, you know, it's elevated horror. But it certainly was a nice way, because I watched it, I think, on October 2nd, and it did feel like a nice way to kick off spooky season in the most, like, general sense of the word, because it just has the atmosphere. It feels very chill and autumnal,
it's a very clammy movie.
Yeah. And that was nice to have on. Yeah. Like, and I think it's going to make an excellent kind of bookend with. So every Halloween, I like to show Ben, my boyfriend, a movie, a classic he has not seen before. And this year, I mean, this is a more contemporary one, but this year I'm going to show him The Others with Nicole Kidman. And I feel like that's going to be a really good double feature bookend thing for me.
I feel like when The Others came out, every third review was probably more like every other review was talking about it as a comparison to the Innocents.
Really? Okay, I was not in the culture at the time, so I didn't know that.
It is. Well, The Innocents is one of those movies that, like, film critics hold in their pocket for, like, if I'm talking about a psychological ghost story, I better compare it to The Innocents, because it's kind of like the version of that. So it would be difficult for them to resist that urge. And I've never reviewed The Others, but if I were to review The Others, it would be difficult for me to resist that urge. So
no, I totally feel that. It is a horror film with that same kind of atmosphere and that kind of, like, well, because it is about the, you know, the crushing repression, but, like, within a family and not in a sexual way. But it's where it's like, these kids, you are not allowed to do anything that you want because it will destroy you, or will it? And it's also got just extremely luscious, beautiful lighting. But anyway,
it beautiful movie. Again, another near career peak performance. I don't think Nicole Kidman has never been better than The Others, but I think that it is near the top of my Kidman power rankings.
Yeah, and another gay person behind it. The director Alejandro Amenábar is a gay man.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, we're not talking about The Others. We're talking about The Innocents. I think we pretty much covered it. I
was gonna say, are we talking about The Innocents? I feel like I love it, and I know that I love it, and I know why one would not love it, and I've already written a review about it. So to a certain extent, I feel like I'm content. I feel like I've said my piece about this enormously beautiful film.
Okay.
And And all I was looking for was to make sure that you agreed that it was enormously beautiful. And if you'd said it's beautiful and I hate it more than I hate Nazism, I would have been like, I'm fine as long as you think it's beautiful, man.
Great. Well, I have two last things I want to throw out. Just some thoughts. I would say the one aesthetic choice that I'm not behind is that there is some injudicious use of slow-mo in certain points.
That's true.
But I would say altogether that's about 35 seconds of the movie. So
it's used like 3 times.
Yeah.
Does that sound right? Twice. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 or 3 times, and I was just like, it's not for me. And then also, what's really they make a really bizarre narrative choice, which is that essentially the film is a chamber piece. It's Miss Gross, it's Miss Giddens, it's Miles and Flora, and it's the ghosts that are partnered with them. Mm-hmm. They mention other staff members. They mention Anna. They mention the cook, but they're not seen. Except for 50 minutes into the movie, Anna opens a door and says, "The kids are in bed," and Deborah Carr says, "Thanks, Anna," and then you never see Anna again. So why put her there at all?
You know, I've watched this movie I don't know how many times. I know the exact scene you're referring to, and it never struck me as being like, well, that's Anna. We don't know who Anna is. I'm a little thrown, actually, in this moment that's never stood out to me as, like, a weird moment, because it is.
Yeah,
it's super weird.
It's really peculiar, because I felt like the movie was staking its claim as in, like, there is a household staff, but we're not going to deal with them. And then they start to deal with them, and then immediately ignore them again, and it's like, well, it just feels incongruous.
No, it does. Yeah, now that you've called that to my attention, I don't know if I can go back. I mean, I can go back, but, like, no, you're right.
Yeah,
Right.
And that poor actress who's in 5 seconds of The Innocents. Anyway, very strange. Like, she's in it less than Miss Jessel is, which is hard to do. But yes, so I think that's going to do it for a conversation on The Innocents. If you haven't checked it out, don't go in expecting, like, the best haunted house movie you'll ever see, but it is a gorgeous film that's worth seeing.
Mm-hmm. It might very well be the single prettiest horror film. Like, I am not immediately coming up with a counter argument in my brain.
I'd have to think about it. It's certainly the prettiest in the way that it is pretty, I think.
It is certainly the prettiest non-Italian horror film that I can come up with.
God, see, I was definitely only thinking of Italian movies when I was trying to come up with the rebuttal.
I was like, let's see, what are the other possibilities? Well, there's Suspiria, there's Blood and Black Lace, there's Inferno, there's this, there's that. I was like, okay, I'm seeing a commonality.
But anyway, so that's that on The Innocents. We're going to be returning in 2 weeks with another Turn of the Screw adaptation, which we haven't decided yet, so we'll get back to you on that.
We will. We'll try to pick one that's not another straight adaptation, probably, because, we've had we said about a fairly faithful adaptation.
Yeah, so, like, it probably won't be the Colin Firth one, because I don't see that one really carving its own path.
Probably not. Even though I do want to see Colin Firth in the Turn of the Screw, so I might watch that one on my own steam. Mm-hmm. But it feels like we would just be having this conversation again without talking about the cinematography.
Yeah, exactly. Which, bummer. Anyway, so yeah, we'll catch you in 2 weeks, and until then, thanks so much for listening, and happy spooky season.
She hates